The boy tried to shield his brother with his body, while the screams echoed through the corral, until the boss's horse approached and, to everyone's surprise, did something no one expected. Miguel Ramirez woke before the sun, as he always did. In the small, converted tack room at the back of the Blackwood stables, the only sound was his own breathing. He reached beneath his narrow cot for the worn wooden box that contained his most precious possessions. A faded photograph of his parents standing in a Nebraska wheat field, his father's harmonica, and his mother's rosary beads. The photograph was creased from years of handling. Elena and Carlos Ramirez smiled at the camera, their faces sunburned from fieldwork but eyes bright with hope. They had come north from Oaxaca when Miguel was just 5, following the harvest and dreams of something better. Those dreams had died with them in a harvester accident when Miguel was 7. That was 10 years ago. A decade of living in the margins of Willow Creek, Nebraska, where the invisible lines between us and them were as clear as the barbed wire fences that separated the properties. Miguel slipped on his work boots and stepped outside. The October air bit through his thin jacket as he made his way across the yard to the main stable. Tom Johnson, the foreman who had taken him in after the accident, would be expecting the morning feed to be measured and distributed before the other hands arrived. The stable was warm with the earthy smell of hay and horses. Miguel moved efficiently down the row of stalls, measuring grain and checking water buckets. The horses nickered softly as he passed, familiar with his presence and rhythm. Early as always, came Tom Johnson's voice from the doorway. The foreman was a barrel-chested man with weathered skin and eyes that had seen everything and judged little. "Rest of the boys won't be here for another hour." "Couldn't sleep," Miguel replied simply. Tom nodded, understanding in his silence. He had raised Miguel alongside his own children in the Foreman'S cottage, always under the disapproving gaze of Richard Blackwood. The owner of the farm tolerated Miguel's presence because Tom was the best foreman in 3 counties. But tolerance was not acceptance. "School bus will be by in an hour," Tom mentioned casually, the same gentle reminder he offered most mornings. Miguel concentrated on measuring oats. "Got too much work here." The familiar dance of words needed no elaboration. They both knew that while the white kids from town sat in classrooms discussing literature and algebra, Miguel would be mucking stalls and exercising yearlings. His education came in calluses and knowing how to predict a storm by the way horses flicked their tails. Through the stable window, Miguel caught sight of a yellow school bus passing on the distant road. Billy and Lucas, Tom's sons, would be on it, along with the Johnson's daughter, Anna. They had become his siblings in everything but blood after Tom and Martha took him in. Still, Miguel felt the weight of difference every time they left for school while he stayed behind. "Something big happening today," Tom said, breaking into Miguel's thoughts. "Boss bought himself a champion. Trailers coming from Omaha this afternoon." By midday, the Blackwood farm hummed with anticipation. Word of the new arrival had spread through the ranch hands. $500,000, they whispered. A purebred stallion with a bloodline stretching back to European royalty. Miguel watched from the shadows of the equipment shed as Richard Blackwood paced the yard in his Italian leather boots, checking his watch every few minutes. The man's sharp features seemed permanently set in disapproval, especially when his gaze landed on Miguel. "Should be here by now," Blackwood snapped at Tom. "Call the transport company again." Tom nodded and stepped away to make the call, passing close to Miguel. "Make yourself useful elsewhere," he muttered quietly. "Boss is in one of his moods." Miguel slipped away toward the north pasture where the 2-year-olds grazed. As he walked, his mind drifted to the early mornings of his childhood when his mother would wake him before dawn. "Ven, mijo," Elena would whisper, leading him to the hills where wild mustangs sometimes gathered in the mist. "Watch how they move together. The horses speak with their eyes. If you learn to truly look, you'll never be alone." After her death, these solitary dawn pilgrimages became Miguel's private ritual. While other ranch hands used whips and spurs, Miguel had developed a different understanding of horses. The animals seemed to sense it, responding to him in ways that sometimes unsettled the other workers. The distant sound of a heavy diesel engine pulled Miguel from his memories. The transport trailer had arrived. Curiosity overcame his desire to avoid Blackwood, and he made his way back to the main yard, keeping to the periphery. The trailer was massive, with Champion Transport emblazoned on its side. 4 men emerged from the cab, their faces tense with concentration. "Be careful with him," one shouted as they prepared the unloading ramp. "He's been agitated since Omaha." Richard Blackwood stood with his chest puffed out, surrounded by several wealthy-looking men from town, members of his country club, Miguel guessed. The rancher was already boasting. "Finest bloodline in the Midwest. Going to revolutionize our breeding program," Blackwood declared, gesturing expansively. "Worth every penny of the $500,000. The trailer door opened, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then a sound emerged that made everyone step back. A furious, challenging neigh that seemed to contain more rage than any animal should possess. "Easy, boy, easy," shouted one of the transporters as the massive black stallion burst from the trailer, nearly trampling a handler who didn't move quickly enough. The horse was magnificent. 17 hands of rippling muscle beneath a coat so black it seemed to absorb the sunlight. His eyes blazed with intelligence and fury. The only interruption in his midnight coloring was a single white lightning-shaped mark on his chest. "Thunderstrike," Blackwood announced proudly, though he kept his distance. "Champion of the Omaha circuit." The stallion reared suddenly, front hooves slashing the air as 2 handlers struggled with the lead ropes. Even from his vantage point, Miguel could see the animal was different, not just spirited or untrained, but haunted by something. "What happened in Omaha?" Tom asked one of the transporters quietly. The man wiped sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "Accident during the exhibition. Part of the arena structure collapsed. Killed his trainer instantly. Horse got trapped for hours with the dead man before they could extract him." Miguel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. He watched as the magnificent animal was forced into a specially reinforced stall, the door secured with additional bolts. "He hasn't let anyone handle him properly since," the transporter continued. Owner was going to put him down, but Blackwood offered cash on the spot. 3 weeks later, the mood at Blackwood Farm had shifted from excitement to fear. Thunderstrike had injured 2 stable hands, destroyed 3 stalls, and bitten a chunk from the arm of an experienced trainer. The magnificent animal had become a nightmare, lunging at anyone who approached, eyes rolling white with terror and rage. "That devil horse needs to be put down before he kills someone," declared Luther McPherson, a celebrated horse trainer whom Blackwood had hired at great expense. After 3 days of attempts with whips, ropes, and even sedatives, Luther was leaving the farm with a broken arm and wounded pride. Miguel had watched Luther's methods from a distance, each crack of the whip making him wince. The trainer had tried to break the stallion's spirit through fear and pain, the traditional way. Each attempt had only increased the horse's frenzy. That evening, in the warm kitchen of the Foreman'S cottage, Tom Johnson shook his head wearily as Martha set a plate of meatloaf before him. "Blackwood's counting his losses," Tom said, cutting into his dinner. "Says he can't keep feeding a monster no one can get near." "It's not the horse's fault," Miguel said quietly, earning curious looks from Billy and Lucas across the table. "Fault doesn't matter in business," Tom replied. $500,000 is walking around destroying property and threatening lives. Numbers don't add up. Miguel pushed his food around his plate, thinking of the magnificent animal isolated in the reinforced stall at the far end of the property. After everyone had gone to bed, he slipped out of the house and made his way through the moonlit farm to Thunderstrike's prison. The night was still except for the occasional frustrated snort and the sound of hooves striking wood. Miguel approached carefully, staying downwind. Through the gaps in the planks, he could see the stallion pacing, his beautiful coat now marred with self-inflicted injuries and marks from Luther's whip. Something about the animal's distress resonated deep within Miguel, the rage of being misunderstood, the fear of a world that saw you as inherently dangerous. Without fully understanding why, Miguel quietly unlatched the stall door and slipped inside. The sound alerted Thunderstrike, who spun around, nostrils flaring, muscles tense to attack. Miguel didn't run. Instead, he slowly sat down on the straw-covered floor, lowered his eyes, and began to hum the lullaby his mother used to sing, a gentle Mexican melody about stars guiding lost travelers home. Thunderstrike reared up, hooves dangerously close to Miguel's head. The boy didn't flinch, didn't look up, just continued his quiet humming. For 40 terrifying minutes, the stallion snorted, pawed, and threatened to charge. Miguel remained motionless, the melody unwavering. Then, like a switch being flipped, the horse stilled. His ears, previously pinned back in aggression, swiveled forward. Thunderstrike regarded the boy not as a threat, but as a puzzle to be solved. For the first time since his arrival, the animal wasn't trying to destroy everything around him. "Tú también estás solo, ¿verdad?" Miguel whispered in Spanish, still not raising his eyes. "You're alone too, aren't you? They treat you like you don't belong anywhere either." The stallion took a tentative step closer, then another, nostrils flaring as he caught Miguel's scent. The boy remained perfectly still, continuing his soft melody. 2 hours passed this way, Miguel sitting motionless on the stall floor, Thunderstrike gradually relaxing, occasionally grazing on hay at the far end of the enclosure, but always keeping the strange human in his sight. The stall door suddenly swung open wider, flooding the space with the beam of a flashlight. Tom Johnson stood there, face pale with shock. "For God's sake, boy, do you have a death wish?" he exclaimed, instinctively reaching to pull Miguel out. The sudden movement and loud voice startled Thunderstrike, who snorted and backed up but, remarkably, didn't charge. Tom froze, his eyes betraying his astonishment at seeing the demon horse in a state of calm that no one had been able to induce. "He's not evil, Tom," Miguel said simply as he stood and dusted straw from his clothes. "He's just scared." He paused, then added quietly, "Just like I was when I first came here." Tom stood speechless, looking between the boy and the horse, seeing something in both their eyes that spoke of a connection forged in the language of the wounded. For the first time, Tom Johnson saw in Miguel's face something he had never noticed before: a purpose. Tom Johnson's weathered face held a mix of concern and wonder as he guided Miguel back to the Foreman'S cottage in the pre-dawn darkness. Neither spoke until they reached the porch, their breath forming small clouds in the chilly Nebraska air. "What you did was foolish," Tom finally said, his voice low to avoid waking his family. "But I've never seen anything like it. That horse has tried to kill everyone who's come near him." Miguel looked toward the eastern horizon where the first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. "I'm going back tomorrow morning." It wasn't a question or a request. Tom recognized the quiet determination in the boy's voice, the same tone Elena Ramirez had used when arguing for better conditions for the migrant workers years ago. "Richard finds out, we're both in trouble," Tom warned, but his voice lacked conviction. He had seen something remarkable in that stall, something that defied his decades of experience with horses. Miguel nodded, understanding the risk. "I'll be careful. No one will know." As the first rays of sunlight broke over the plains the next morning, Miguel slipped out of bed. He retrieved his father's old harmonica from the wooden box beneath his cot. Carlos Ramirez had played it during rare moments of rest, filling worker cabins with melancholy Mexican folk songs that spoke of home. Miguel had never properly learned to play, but he tucked the instrument into his pocket and made his way through the quiet farm. The other workers wouldn't arrive for hours, and Tom had given him tacit permission by assigning him early feed duty near Thunderstrike's isolated stall. The stallion sensed Miguel's approach before the boy came into view. His ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he caught the now familiar scent. When Miguel appeared at the stall door, Thunderstrike backed to the far corner, not with the violent panic he showed others, but with cautious assessment. Miguel entered slowly, telegraphing each movement. He sat in the same spot as the night before, legs crossed, eyes lowered respectfully. From his pocket he produced the harmonica. The first notes were awkward and dissonant, a halting attempt at a country tune that played constantly on the ranch radio. Thunderstrike's ears twitched at the unexpected sound, head raised high, muscles tense. Miguel played for nearly an hour, his melody gradually becoming more coherent. The horse remained at the far end of the stall, watching. When Miguel finally stopped, he simply sat in silence, existing in the same space without demands or expectations. Before leaving, he placed an apple in the center of the stall, then backed out slowly. Thunderstrike didn't approach the fruit until Miguel was long gone. This became their ritual in the gray hours of dawn. Each morning, Miguel would sit and play, his notes becoming slightly more skilled each day. Thunderstrike's reactions evolved almost imperceptibly. Standing slightly closer, ears more relaxed, occasional curious tilting of his massive head. On the 5th day, the stallion approached near enough to sniff the air 2 yards from where Miguel sat. On the 10th, he accepted an apple placed strategically in the middle of the stall. On the 15th morning, Miguel held his breath as Thunderstrike stretched his neck forward and, with velvet lips, took the fruit directly from his outstretched palm. The moment was so gentle, so contrary to the animal's reputation, that Miguel felt tears stinging his eyes. The connection between them, forged in quiet patience, felt sacred. "You two are fixing each other," observed Martha Johnson one morning as she placed a stack of pancakes before Miguel at the breakfast table. Her kind eyes missed nothing, especially the way the once withdrawn boy now looked people in the eyes when speaking about Thunderstrike. "Don't know what you mean," Miguel mumbled, though his face warmed at her perception. "Before that horse, you never talked about the future," Martha said, ruffling his hair as she passed. "Now I hear you making plans." It was true. Miguel had begun researching equine behavior in tattered library books that Nancy Redfield, the retired librarian, mysteriously left on the Johnsons' porch. He practiced new melodies on the harmonica, noting which ones seemed to relax Thunderstrike most. For the first time since his parents' death, Miguel was looking forward rather than simply surviving. Meanwhile, in the dining room of the Willow Creek Country Club, Richard Blackwood stabbed at his prime rib while holding court with the town's elite. The conversation inevitably turned to his expensive problem. "Heard you've got a $500,000 lawn ornament out there, Richard," chuckled Harold Green, owner of the local bank. "That stallion still giving you fits?" Blackwood's face tightened. "That damn Mexican kid is wasting his time and my money. Tom Johnson will lose his job if he doesn't get that boy away from my stables." He brought his fist down on the white tablecloth, rattling the silverware. "Horses don't need psychologists. They need trainers with a firm hand." Word of the daily encounters between the Mexican boy and the killer horse began spreading through Willow Creek. The small farming community had little in the way of entertainment, and the story was too compelling to ignore. For Miguel, this growing attention manifested in unexpected visitors to the stables. The first was old Hank Williams, sharing a name with the country singer, though no relation, a Vietnam veteran who walked with difficulty using a cane fashioned from an old rifle. Hank appeared one morning as Miguel was finishing his session with Thunderstrike. The old man stood at a respectful distance, watching silently until Miguel emerged from the stall. "Horses know a broken soul when they see one," Hank said without preamble, offering Miguel a chocolate bar. "When I came back from Nam, nobody understood what was in my head. Nobody except old Samson, a bay gelding nobody wanted." He unwrapped his own chocolate, the paper crinkling loudly in his gnarled fingers. "Sometimes, son, it's the animals that save us, not the other way around." Miguel accepted the chocolate with a quiet, "Thanks," uncertain how to respond to this unexpected alliance. Soon others began appearing, Nancy Redfield herself, bringing more books on equine behavior. Sheriff Johnson, no relation to Tom, disguising his curiosity with faux reports of disturbance complaints. And most surprisingly, Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, owner of the neighboring ranch and county judge, an imposing 70-year-old woman who had broken more wild horses than any man in the region. After observing in silence for nearly an hour one morning, Eleanor Jenkins delivered her assessment with characteristic bluntness. "You have the gift, boy," she declared, her silver hair catching the morning light. "It's not technique, it's respect. Most men are too busy proving their strength to understand that." Miguel had developed a unique routine with Thunderstrike. Noticing the horse startled at sudden movements, he began telegraphing each action before executing it. A soft whistle before standing, a specific word before extending his hand. Observing the animal's terror at the sight of ropes, instruments of his previous trauma, Miguel created a soft fabric halter that more resembled a scarf. When he first brought a brush, Thunderstrike retreated violently to the corner of the stall, eyes white with fear. Instead of pursuing, Miguel simply placed the brush on the ground and backed away. The next day, he did the same. On the third day, he began brushing his own arm with gentle strokes, demonstrating the tool's purpose. On the 10th day, Thunderstrike approached close enough to sniff the brush. On the 12th, he allowed a brief touch to his neck, a gesture lasting only 2 seconds, but for Miguel, it represented a victory greater than any trophy. Each small breakthrough required patience that defied the traditional timeline of horse training. Tom Johnson, increasingly worried about Blackwood's escalating threats, finally confronted Miguel one evening in the tack room. "Boy, you're playing with fire," he said, sitting heavily on a wooden bench. "The boss isn't bluffing when he says he'll fire me. I've got 3 mouths to feed besides you." Miguel looked up from the soft rope halter he was modifying. In the lamplight, his 17 years seemed both too young and too old, a boy carrying adult burdens. "2 more weeks, Tom," he pleaded. "If I can't ride him by then, I'll leave on my own. I don't want your family to suffer because of me." Tom studied the boy who had become like a son to him. Miguel had never asked for anything in the 10 years since the accident, had simply worked twice as hard as anyone else to justify his place at their table. 2 weeks, Tom agreed reluctantly. "But be careful. That horse is unpredictable, no matter how gentle he seems with you." Miguel nodded, but both knew that Thunderstrike wasn't the real threat. Richard Blackwood's patience was wearing thinner than the autumn ice on the creek that gave the town its name. Fate, however, chose its own schedule. 3 days later, a devastating storm swept through Willow Creek with little warning. The sky turned an eerie green-black as workers rushed to secure equipment and bring animals to shelter. Lightning split the Nebraska sky, followed almost instantly by deafening thunder. Miguel was helping Tom secure the main barn doors when a blinding flash and explosive crack told them lightning had struck nearby. The acrid smell of smoke reached them seconds later. "The North Stable!" someone shouted through the howling wind. Miguel's heart stopped. The North Stable housed Thunderstrike's isolated stall. Without hesitation, he bolted into the storm, ignoring Tom's shouts to wait. Rain lashed at his face as he sprinted across the muddy yard, following the growing glow of flames. The lightning had hit one corner of the old wooden structure. Fire was spreading rapidly along the roof and smoke poured from the eaves. Miguel could hear panicked whinnies from inside. Not just Thunderstrike, but several other horses housed in the building. Other workers arrived, forming a bucket brigade from the nearby pump. Miguel fought his way to Thunderstrike's stall at the far end. The smoke was thicker here, and he could hear the stallion's frantic movements inside. When he opened the stall door, a section of the roof collapsed with a terrible splintering crash. Miguel lunged forward, driven by instinct rather than reason, and felt a searing pain as something heavy struck his shoulder. Through a haze of smoke and pain, he was aware of Thunderstrike rearing and screaming. Then darkness took him. When Tom Johnson and 2 other workers fought their way to Thunderstrike's stall minutes later, they found a scene none would ever forget. The massive black stallion stood protectively over Miguel's unconscious form. When the men approached, the horse, which had attacked every human who came near him for months, pinned his ears and positioned himself between them and the boy. "Easy, boy," Tom called desperately, seeing blood on Miguel's forehead. "We need to help him." Thunderstrike snorted warningly, hooves planted firmly on either side of Miguel's body. Only when Miguel stirred slightly, mumbling incoherent Spanish words, did the stallion reluctantly step aside, though his eyes never left the men as they carefully lifted the boy. "Not possible," murmured Richard Blackwood when he heard of the incident, his voice betraying a rare moment of doubt. "Horses don't protect people." "This one did," Martha Johnson replied simply as she cleaned the cut on Miguel's forehead in the warm kitchen of their cottage. "And we all saw it." Miguel regained consciousness on the Johnsons' couch, his head pounding and shoulder throbbing. Through the window, he could see the smoldering remains of the north stable against the dawn sky. "Thunderstrike?" he asked immediately, his voice hoarse from smoke. "He's fine," Tom assured him. "In the main barn. Won't eat or settle, though. Keeps looking toward the house." "2 more weeks, Tom," Miguel whispered, his eyes closing again as exhaustion claimed him. "If I can't ride him by then, I'll go." He drifted back to sleep, unaware that in the barn, Thunderstrike stood alert in his temporary stall, ears pointed toward the foreman's cottage where his unlikely savior recovered. Miguel's dreams were punctuated by the scent of smoke and the sound of splintering wood. He woke with a start, wincing as pain shot through his bandaged shoulder. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the Johnsons' small guest room, where Martha had insisted he stay until he recovered. 3 days had passed since the fire, but when Miguel closed his eyes, he could still see the flames licking at the stable roof, still feel the crushing weight of the falling beam. "You're awake," Martha said, appearing in the doorway with a steaming mug. "How's the shoulder?" "Fine," Miguel lied, struggling to sit up. "I need to see Thunderstrike." Martha set the mug on the bedside table. "Doctor said you shouldn't move around much for another day at least." "Please," Miguel said, his voice cracking slightly. "I need to make sure he's okay." Something in his tone must have reached her because Martha's expression softened. "Tom says that horse hasn't eaten properly since they moved him to the main barn. Stands there looking at the house all day." She helped Miguel into a sitting position. "Let me get Tom to help you out there, but just for a few minutes. You took a nasty hit to the head." 20 minutes later, Miguel found himself leaning heavily on Tom's arm as they crossed the yard to the main stable. The charred skeleton of the north stable stood as a stark reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. The acrid smell of wet ash still hung in the air. "Boss has been asking about you," Tom said as they walked. "Never seen him so confused. Keeps saying horses don't protect people." Miguel remained silent, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. His head throbbed with each step, but the need to see Thunderstrike overrode the pain. They reached the main stable, and the familiar sense of hay and horse enveloped him. Several stable hands stopped their work to nod respectfully as he passed, a new experience for Miguel, who had always been invisible to most of the workers. At the far end of the aisle, in the largest stall, Thunderstrike stood with his head hanging low. The magnificent black coat had lost its luster, and he ignored the untouched hay at his feet. When Miguel approached the stall door, the stallion's head shot up, nostrils flaring as he caught the boy's scent. "Hey, amigo," Miguel said softly in Spanish. "I heard you've been worried about me." The horse nickered softly, a sound Tom had never heard from the animal before. Thunderstrike approached the stall door, his movements careful, almost tender, as he stretched his neck to sniff Miguel's hair and face. "I've never," Tom began, then fell silent, watching as the stallion that had terrorized the farm for months now gently nuzzled the boy's cheek. "Could I have a moment alone with him?" Miguel asked. Tom hesitated. "You can barely stand, kid." "I'll sit right here," Miguel promised, indicating a bale of hay beside the stall door. 5 minutes. After Tom reluctantly stepped away, Miguel opened the stall door and eased himself inside. Thunderstrike backed up slightly, creating space as if understanding Miguel's fragile state. The boy sat on the straw-covered floor, leaning against the wall for support. "You saved me," Miguel whispered, reaching up to stroke the velvet muzzle that lowered to his level. "They say you wouldn't let anyone near me until I woke up." Thunderstrike blew softly through his nostrils, the warm breath ruffling Miguel's hair. For several minutes, they simply existed together in the quiet stall, two beings who had found unlikely sanctuary in each other. Word of the incident spread quickly through Willow Creek. The story grew with each telling, how the killer horse had stood guard over the Mexican boy, how it had allowed rescuers to approach only when Miguel spoke to it, how it now pined when separated from him. Richard Blackwood arrived at the main stable later that afternoon, his expensive boots carefully avoiding the muddier patches of the yard. He found Miguel still sitting in Thunderstrike's stall, the stallion standing quietly beside him. "Johnson told me you were out here," Blackwood said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "Should you be up with that head injury?" "I'm fine, sir," Miguel replied, automatically deferential in the presence of the owner. Blackwood studied the tableau before him, the fierce animal that had attacked his best trainers now standing docile beside the thin Mexican boy. "That animal cost me $500,000, he said finally, "and until now, all it's done is destroy property and injure my people." He leaned against the stall door. "But I suppose if it's decided you're its person, that changes things." Miguel recognized the calculating look in Blackwood's eyes, not appreciation for the bond that had formed, but assessment of potential value. "He was scared," Miguel said quietly. "Not mean, just scared." "Fear, meanness, doesn't matter in business," Blackwood replied, echoing Tom's earlier sentiment. "Results matter. And if you can control this animal when no one else can, that's a result I can work with." That evening, Miguel was allowed to return to the stables despite Martha's protests. A cot was set up in an empty stall next to Thunderstrike's, and for the first time since the fire, the stallion ate his full ration of grain. Over the next week, as Miguel's strength returned, Thunderstrike's transformation became the talk of the farm. The horse that once lunged at anyone who approached now followed Miguel's gentle commands, accepting a halter and eventually allowing the boy to lead him into the small corral behind the stables. On a crisp morning 2 weeks after the fire, the first real test came. Miguel, his shoulder still tender but healing, brought a soft blanket to the corral where Thunderstrike stood. "Easy, hermano," he murmured, showing the blanket to the horse before making any move to place it on his back. Thunderstrike's ears flicked nervously, but he remained still as Miguel gently draped the blanket over his broad back. When the horse accepted this without protest, Miguel felt tears of triumph sting his eyes. Tom Johnson watched from the fence, shaking his head in amazement. "I've been breaking horses for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this." "He's not broken," Miguel corrected gently. "We're just learning to trust each other." By the end of that week, Miguel had progressed to sitting on Thunderstrike's back for brief moments in the corral. No saddle, no bit, just the soft rope halter and quiet words in a mixture of English and Spanish. The stallion, once deemed unrideable, carried the boy carefully, as if aware of his healing injuries. The morning Miguel first rode Thunderstrike beyond the corral, a small audience had gathered. Farm workers paused in their tasks to watch. Tom and Martha stood arm in arm by the gate. Even Eleanor Jenkins had driven over from her neighboring ranch to witness what many were calling a miracle. "Look at that," Martha whispered as Miguel and Thunderstrike moved as one entity across the east pasture, the rising sun gilding them in golden light. "You can't tell where the boy ends and the horse begins." Even Richard Blackwood, watching from the window of his study in the main house, felt something stir within him at the sight. The $500,000 liability had transformed into something potentially valuable again, though he couldn't quite articulate the nature of that value, even to himself. As Miguel's bond with Thunderstrike deepened, a subtle shift occurred in how the other workers treated him. Men who had previously ignored his existence now nodded respectfully when he passed. Women from the farm kitchen saved special treats for Miguel's horse. He had become visible through his connection to the magnificent animal. The stallion, too, changed visibly. His coat regained its glossy sheen. His eyes lost the wild, haunted look that had characterized him since the Omaha accident. With Miguel, he was gentle, attentive, almost tender. With others, he remained aloof, but no longer aggressive. One evening, as Miguel groomed Thunderstrike in the gathering dusk, Richard Blackwood approached with an unusual companion, Dr. Harriet Mills, an equine veterinarian from Lincoln. "I'd like Dr. Mills to examine him," Blackwood said, keeping a respectful distance from the stall. "Make sure he's physically sound after all he's been through." Miguel tensed, and Thunderstrike immediately picked up on his unease, shifting position to place himself between the boy and the visitors. "It's okay," Miguel soothed, stroking the horse's neck. "They just want to help." Dr. Mills, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and practical hands, waited patiently. "I won't do anything without your permission," she said to Miguel, not Blackwood, a distinction that wasn't lost on the boy. "He clearly trusts you, and I respect that relationship." The examination proceeded slowly, with Miguel guiding Thunderstrike through each step. The veterinarian worked with gentle efficiency, murmuring approval at the stallion's improved condition. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," she told Miguel afterward. "I've treated horses with trauma before, but I've never seen a recovery like this." She turned to Blackwood. "This animal has formed a profound bond with this young man. Separating them would be detrimental to the horse's continued rehabilitation." Blackwood nodded thoughtfully, though Miguel caught a flicker of calculation in his eyes. "Then we'll make sure they stay together," the rancher said smoothly. "Miguel is a valued member of our operation." The words rang hollow, but Miguel was too focused on Thunderstrike to challenge them. The stallion had allowed a stranger to examine him without incident, another milestone in his recovery. As fall deepened toward winter, Miguel and Thunderstrike developed a morning ritual that became legendary on the farm. Before dawn, when the world was still draped in darkness, they would ride out to the eastern hills. There, as the first light broke over the horizon, they would gallop freely across the open prairie, man and horse moving in perfect harmony, without saddle or bridle to separate them. Workers driving in for the early shift would sometimes glimpse them in the distance, silhouettes against the rising sun, moving with such unity that it seemed more dance than riding. "Reminds me of stories my grandfather told," said Hank Williams one morning as he watched from the road. "About Plains Indians who rode like they were part of the horse. Said those riders could talk to horses with their thoughts." The morning rides became a symbol of possibility, a daily reminder that patience and understanding could heal wounds that force could never touch. "He's not the same boy," Martha told Tom as they watched Miguel return from one such ride, his face flushed with joy. "He's finding himself through that horse." "And that horse found himself through him," Tom replied. "Two broken souls making each other whole." While observing Miguel and Thunderstrike's morning ride from his study, Richard Blackwood murmured to Tom, "Perhaps that animal is worth something after all." And the calculating gleam in his eyes made it clear that his admiration was not for the miracle of connection, but for the possibility of profiting from it. As Blackwood stood watching from his office window, a flicker of avarice crossed his face, transforming his momentary wonder into cold calculation. The morning sun illuminated Miguel and Thunderstrike moving as one across the eastern pasture, their silhouette a testament to something most of the ranch hands had deemed impossible just weeks earlier. The frost-covered ground crunched beneath Miguel's boots as he led Thunderstrike back to the stables after their dawn ride. The stallion's breath created plumes of vapor in the cold November air, his black coat gleaming with a thin layer of sweat despite the chill. Miguel could feel eyes on them, not just the usual curious glances from workers, but something more intense. Looking up, he caught Richard Blackwood's gaze from the study window before the man quickly pulled the curtain closed. "He's got that look again," Tom Johnson said, appearing beside Miguel with a pitchfork in hand. "The one that means he's counting dollars in his head." Miguel nodded, understanding perfectly. After a month of daily progress with Thunderstrike, the stallion had transformed from a liability into an asset. Where once Blackwood had considered destroying the $500,000 mistake, he now boasted to visitors about the remarkable recovery of his prized stallion. What he never mentioned was Miguel's role in that transformation. "Let him think what he wants," Miguel replied, rubbing Thunderstrike's forelock. "As long as we're left alone to do things our way." The stallion leaned into Miguel's touch, his dark eyes half closed in contentment. The wounds from his early days at the farm had healed, leaving only thin white scars that disappeared beneath his winter coat. The psychological scars ran deeper, but those too were gradually fading. Thunderstrike still startled at sudden movements and refused to let anyone but Miguel handle him, but the blind panic that had driven him to attack was gone. Inside the stable, Miguel removed the soft rope halter, the only tack Thunderstrike would tolerate, and began their post-ride grooming ritual. Every brushstroke followed the same pattern, every movement telegraphed in advance. The routine created security for the traumatized horse, a predictability that allowed him to relax. "You're getting heavy," Miguel teased as Thunderstrike leaned against him, forcing the boy to brace himself against the gentle weight. "Martha's apple mash is making you lazy." The stallion snorted as if understanding the accusation, causing Miguel to laugh. This quiet moment of connection was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel, followed by the harsh slam of a car door. Thunderstrike's ears immediately pricked forward, his body tensing. Miguel placed a reassuring hand on his neck, feeling the muscles bunched beneath his palm. "Easy, it's nothing," he murmured, though his own body had tensed reflexively. The loud, arrogant voice that echoed across the yard confirmed Miguel's suspicion. Richard Blackwood Jr. had returned to the farm. The 20-year-old son of the owner was notorious among the workers for his cruelty and entitlement. He'd been away at an expensive boarding school in Connecticut, sent there after a drunk driving incident that his father's money and influence had kept out of the local papers. "Sounds like Junior's home," Tom muttered, appearing at the stable entrance. His normally impassive face showed uncharacteristic disgust. "School called yesterday. Seems he got himself expelled." Miguel continued brushing Thunderstrike, keeping his expression neutral, though his stomach had knotted. "How long is he staying?" "Who knows? Last time he made it 3 weeks before picking a fight at the Rusty Nail that got him banned from half the businesses in town." Tom hesitated. "Keep your distance if you can, Miguel, and keep the boys away from him too." The warning was unnecessary. In the years before being sent away, Blackwood Jr. had made a sport of tormenting the children of farm workers, particularly those with brown skin. Miguel had learned to become invisible when Junior was around, a skill developed through painful experience. For 2 days, Miguel managed to avoid direct contact with the younger Blackwood, though he sensed the man's presence like a storm front moving through the farm. Workers spoke in hushed tones and kept their heads down. Children were kept close to their parents rather than allowed to play freely in the yards. On the 3rd day, Miguel was leading Thunderstrike back from their morning ride when he heard the unmistakable sound of a child crying. The noise came from behind the equipment shed, out of sight from the main house. Without hesitation, he secured Thunderstrike to a hitching post and moved quickly toward the sound. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. 7-year-old Lucas, Tom's youngest son and Miguel's adoptive brother, sat sprawled in the mud, his face streaked with tears and dirt. Standing over him was Richard Blackwood Jr., his handsome face twisted in a cruel smirk. Billy, Lucas's 10-year-old brother, stood nearby, fists clenched but hesitating in the face of the much larger man. "Your father is a loser Mexican who died because he was too stupid to operate a tractor," Junior was saying, his voice slurred slightly despite the early hour. "You're nothing but charity cases. My father should have thrown you all out years ago." Lucas sobbed harder, trying to stand up only to be shoved back into the mud by Junior's expensive boot. "My dad isn't Mexican," the child protested through his tears. "And Miguel's parents died in an accident." "Same thing," Junior laughed. "Too stupid to get out of the way. Probably drunk on tequila." Billy finally found his courage and stepped forward. "Leave him alone. Our dad is the foreman here." Junior's response was a casual backhand that caught Billy across the face with enough force to send him sprawling, blood immediately streaming from his nose. "Your dad is an employee, a servant, just like the rest of you." Miguel crossed the distance in seconds, placing himself between Junior and the children. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but firm. "They're just kids." Junior's eyes widened in momentary surprise before narrowing with malice. "Well, if it isn't the horse whisperer himself." He stepped closer, alcohol fumes wafting from his breath. "Dad can't stop talking about how valuable you've suddenly become. The miracle worker who tamed the crazy stallion." Miguel helped Billy to his feet, checking his bleeding nose. "Go to your mom," he told the boy quietly. "Take Lucas with you." "You don't give orders on my father's property," Junior snarled, grabbing Miguel's shoulder roughly. "These brats need to learn their place, and so do you, wetback." Miguel felt heat rise in his chest, not just anger at the slur, but a deeper, protective fury he'd never experienced before. Before he could respond, a shadow fell across them. "Is there a problem here?" Richard Blackwood Sr. stood watching, his expression unreadable. Junior immediately adopted an injured tone. "These kids were messing with the equipment, Dad. I was just telling them to be careful." Richard's gaze took in the scene. His son's flushed face, Billy's bloody nose, Lucas's tear-streaked cheeks, and Miguel standing protectively before the children. For a moment, Miguel thought he saw a flicker of disgust in the older man's eyes, but it vanished quickly. "My son is just putting these kids in their place," Blackwood declared, a cold smile forming on his lips. "Perhaps you need a lesson too, Ramirez." The threat hung in the air, but Miguel's attention was drawn to Lucas, who had begun to sob again, clutching his elbow where a bruise was forming. "These children need medical attention," Miguel said evenly, refusing to be baited. "Then take them to their mother," Blackwood replied dismissively. "And while we're discussing duties, that horse of yours is now worth money again thanks to you. It's time professional trainers took over." Miguel felt as though the ground had dropped from beneath him. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've done well making him manageable again. But now we need real horsemen to prepare him for breeding and competition." Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. "You'll return to your regular stable duties tomorrow." "Thunderstrike won't accept another handler," Miguel protested. "He needs consistency, trust. What he needs is irrelevant," Blackwood cut him off. "What matters is what I need from my investment. That will be all, Ramirez." As Miguel led the boys away, he heard Junior laugh. "Better say goodbye to your pet, Mexican. Maybe Dad will let you clean its stall sometimes." That evening, the Johnson kitchen became the site of a painful family council. Martha applied arnica to Lucas's bruises while Tom paced the worn linoleum floor, his face a mask of controlled rage. "We should file a complaint with the sheriff," Martha suggested, her gentle hands belying the steel in her voice. Tom shook his head. "Against the Blackwoods? In this county? We might as well pack our bags tonight." Miguel sat at the table, staring at his untouched coffee. The news about Thunderstrike had left him hollow, as though something vital had been carved from his chest. "I can't let them separate us," he said finally. "Thunderstrike will panic with strange handlers. He could hurt himself or others." "It's not fair, but it's the real world," Tom explained, placing a weathered hand on Miguel's shoulder. "People like Blackwood always win. The horse is his property, legally. But Thunderstrike isn't a sofa or a tractor," Miguel argued, tears threatening to spill despite his efforts to contain them. "He has feelings, memories. He'll panic with strangers again. He might hurt himself or someone else." The room fell silent except for Lucas's occasional sniffles. Billy sat with an ice pack pressed to his swollen nose, his young face set in an expression far too old for his years. "What if I left?" Miguel suggested suddenly. "Took Thunderstrike and just went somewhere else?" "That's horse theft, son," Tom said gently. "They'd hunt you down and throw you in jail. And where would you go? You're 17 with no money, no papers." The crushing reality of his situation settled on Miguel's shoulders like a physical weight. As an undocumented orphan, his options were non-existent. Without the Johnsons, he would have no home, no future. Martha Johnson, usually the voice of practical reason, surprised everyone with her next words. "There comes a time in life when you need to decide what kind of person you want to be," she said, her hand stilling on Lucas's arm. "Someone who accepts injustice, or someone who fights against it, even when it seems impossible to win." Tom looked at his wife with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Martha, what are you suggesting?" She straightened, her kind face suddenly fierce with determination. "I'm suggesting that this community has let the Blackwoods bully and exploit people for too long. I'm suggesting that Miguel and Thunderstrike deserve better than to be treated as property. And I'm suggesting that maybe, just maybe, we're not as powerless as we think." As she spoke, Miguel felt something ignite within him. Not just anger or desperation, but a spark of hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Martha was right. Some connections were too important to surrender without a fight. In the darkness of the stable, Miguel pressed his forehead against Thunderstrike's, silent tears streaming down his face. "I won't let them separate us, hermano," he whispered, unaware that at that exact moment, Eleanor Jenkins was drafting documents that would shake the foundations of power in Willow Creek. Eleanor Jenkins arrived at the Blackwood estate just as the morning mist was lifting from the fields. Her silver Lincoln Town car seemed out of place among the mud-spattered farm trucks, a relic of elegance in a world of utility. At 73, Eleanor moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms and boardrooms, commanding respect without having to demand it. Today, however, she wasn't alone. Sheriff Johnson's patrol car pulled in behind her, its official presence immediately drawing curious glances from the workers. "You sure about this, Eleanor?" the sheriff asked as he joined her at the bottom of the steps leading to Blackwood's imposing Victorian farmhouse. "Richard's got friends in the State House." Eleanor straightened her camel hair coat, an official-looking envelope tucked under her arm. "I've been judging cases in this county since before those politicians had their first kiss, Carl. Let them call whoever they want." From the stables, Miguel watched the two figures approach the main house, his heart racing. After his conversation with Martha the previous night, he'd barely slept, spending the hours before dawn with Thunderstrike, speaking softly to the horse about his fears. The stallion had seemed to understand, standing unnaturally still, his dark eyes fixed on Miguel's face as if absorbing every word. "Something's happening," Tom Johnson said, appearing beside Miguel at the stable door. His voice was hushed, but Miguel could detect an unfamiliar note of hope. Richard Blackwood opened his front door before Eleanor could knock, his expression shifting from confusion to wariness when he spotted the sheriff behind her. "Eleanor, Carl," he acknowledged with a tight smile. "Rather early for social calls, isn't it?" "This isn't social, Richard," Eleanor replied, holding out the envelope. "You're being served with formal complaints of animal cruelty, labor violations, and assault on minors." Blackwood's laugh was sharp and dismissive as he took the envelope, tearing it open with manicured fingers. "You think you can scare me with paperwork, Eleanor? I have half the politicians in this state in my pocket." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied calmly, her voice carrying across the yard. "But you don't have the people of this town. Look around you." Blackwood's gaze followed her gesture, his confident expression faltering as he took in the scene beyond his manicured lawn. Dozens of Willow Creek residents stood in silent rows along his property line, farmers in worn overalls, the Methodist pastor in his collar, Grace Cooper who ran the diner, families with children who should have been in school. They carried handmade signs reading, "Justice for Thunderstrike, Respect for Animals," and "Willow Creek Against Tyrants." "What is this circus?" Blackwood demanded, his voice rising. Sheriff Johnson stepped forward, a stack of papers in his hand. "I have sworn statements from 15 former employees detailing systematic animal abuse on your property, Richard. Horses beaten beyond training necessity, deliberate medical neglect, insurance documents falsified to cover up injuries." "You can't prove any of this," Blackwood hissed, though his face had paled slightly. "We don't have to prove all of it," Eleanor replied. "Just enough to warrant a full investigation. How do you think your business partners in Omaha will react to headlines about animal cruelty investigations? Or those politicians you mentioned? Will they still take your calls when your name becomes toxic?" In the stables, Miguel had taken advantage of the distraction to spend precious time with Thunderstrike. The stallion sensed his anxiety, standing unusually close, occasionally lowering his head to nudge Miguel's shoulder gently. "Today we need to be stronger than ever, amigo," Miguel whispered, running his hands along the horse's powerful neck. "They might try to separate us." Thunderstrike's ears flicked back and forth, catching Miguel's words and the distant voices from the front of the property. The horse had developed an uncanny ability to read Miguel's emotions, responding to shifts in his breathing and tension in his body that even Miguel himself sometimes wasn't aware of. Tom Johnson appeared at the stable door, his weathered face showing a mixture of fear and resolve. "They're bringing in reporters," he said quietly. "Eleanor's called Richard's bluff, and the whole town is backing her play." "What about your job?" Miguel asked, knowing how much the Johnson family depended on Tom's position. Tom straightened his shoulders, a decision visibly settling over him. "Some things matter more than a paycheck, son. Martha was right about that." With that, he turned and walked deliberately toward the gathering crowd, joining his neighbors in their silent protest. By midday, the Blackwood farm had transformed into something resembling a media event. 2 vans from local television stations had parked along the road, reporters with microphones interviewing residents about their experiences with the Blackwood family. Martha Johnson moved through the crowd with a cooler, distributing water bottles and sandwiches to people standing in the unseasonable heat. Richard Blackwood watched from his porch, phone pressed to his ear as he made call after call, his face growing increasingly frustrated with each conversation. His political allies, sensing a potential scandal, had suddenly become unavailable or non-committal. The arrival of a massive custom pickup truck with Texas plates drew everyone's attention. Dwayne Harrington, a corpulent man in an expensive cowboy hat, emerged from the vehicle and surveyed the scene with obvious discomfort. "What in tarnation is going on here, Blackwood?" he called out as he approached the house. "You didn't mention I'd be buying into a local rebellion." Richard hurried down the steps to greet the Texan, forcing a smile. "Just a minor disagreement with some employees, Dwayne. Nothing that affects our deal." Harrington chewed thoughtfully on a toothpick as he took in the growing crowd and the news cameras. "Doesn't look minor to me, and it sure as hell affects our deal if I'm buying a horse that comes with this much baggage." He nodded toward the protesters. "I've got a reputation to protect in the breeding circuit. Can't have my name associated with whatever this is." "The horse is sound," Blackwood insisted. "Worth every penny of the $1 million we agreed on." "Maybe," Harrington drawled, "but I'm not sure I want the headache. Perhaps we should reconsider our arrangement, Blackwood." Fury flashed across Richard's face. He turned toward the stables and shouted to his remaining loyal workers, "Get that horse ready for transport now. I want him loaded in Harrington's trailer within the hour." The sudden commotion drew Miguel from Thunderstrike's stall. The stallion immediately sensed the change in atmosphere, his muscles tensing as unfamiliar men approached with halters and lead ropes. "Stay back," Miguel warned, positioning himself protectively in front of the stall door. "He'll panic if strangers try to handle him." "Move aside, boy," ordered Jenkins, Blackwood's head stable hand. "Boss wants the horse loaded now." "He's not ready," Miguel insisted. "You'll undo months of progress if you force him." The standoff drew the attention of the crowd, who began moving toward the stables. Eleanor Jenkins and Sheriff Johnson pushed their way to the front, followed closely by news cameras. "What's happening here?" Eleanor demanded. "Mr. Blackwood has ordered us to prepare the horse for transport," Jenkins explained uncomfortably, aware of the cameras. "The boy is interfering." Richard Blackwood strode into the stables, Harrington trailing behind with a skeptical expression. "This is my property," Blackwood announced loudly. "That horse belongs to me, and it's being loaded into Mr. Harrington's trailer today." "The horse isn't ready for transport," Eleanor countered. "Dr. Mills's report specifically states that separating him from Miguel at this stage could trigger a dangerous regression." "I don't need permission to move my own property," Blackwood snapped, then turned to Jenkins. "Get the tranquilizers if necessary, but get that horse loaded." The workers hesitated, looking between their employer and the gathering crowd of their neighbors and friends. One by one, they stepped back, unwilling to participate. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. "You're all fired, every last one of you!" He grabbed a lead rope from the wall and moved toward Thunderstrike's stall himself. Miguel quickly slipped inside, closing the door behind him. Thunderstrike immediately positioned himself protectively beside the boy, ears pinned back in warning as Blackwood approached. "Open this door immediately," Blackwood demanded. "Sheriff, arrest this boy for trespassing." Sheriff Johnson stepped forward, but not to comply with Blackwood's order. "Technically, Richard, he's still your employee with authorization to be here, and there are about 50 witnesses watching how you handle this situation." Blackwood looked around at the sea of hostile faces surrounding him. Neighbors he'd ignored, workers he'd exploited, a community he'd dismissed for decades. For the first time, A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Richard," Eleanor said quietly, "there's a simple way to resolve this. Let's discuss a reasonable arrangement that respects both your property rights and the welfare of the animal." "I don't negotiate with employees or animals," Blackwood spat. Inside the stall, Miguel placed a calming hand on Thunderstrike's neck. The stallion was trembling with tension, nostrils flared, but holding himself in check at Miguel's touch. The boy whispered soothing words in Spanish, maintaining the connection that had saved them both. Harrington stepped forward, removing his hat. "Look, Blackwood, I came here for a champion stallion, not a public relations disaster. Either we find a sensible solution, or I'm walking away from this deal entirely." The threat of losing his $1 million sale finally penetrated Blackwood's rage. He looked from the determined boy to the protective horse to the wall of community solidarity facing him. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll postpone the transport until alternate arrangements can be made." A collective exhale passed through the crowd. It wasn't a victory, but it was a reprieve. As the tension temporarily subsided, Miguel remained in the stall with Thunderstrike, the horse's powerful body still vibrating with anxiety. Outside, he could hear Eleanor and Jason Morris, the young lawyer who had recently moved to town, discussing legal strategies with the sheriff. Through the stable window, Miguel watched Blackwood retreat to his house, his son lurking on the porch with a face darkened by resentment. This wasn't over. It was merely a battle line being drawn. "If you want to take Thunderstrike, you'll have to take me too," Miguel declared, his voice trembling slightly, but his eyes showing a determination that made even the most hardened of Blackwood's foremen pause in their tracks. The impasse was formed. The impasse at Blackwood Farm quickly transformed from a local dispute into the biggest event Willow Creek had witnessed in decades. By the following morning, news vans from Lincoln and even Omaha lined the county road leading to the property. Reporters with microphones interviewed longtime residents who shared not only the extraordinary story of Miguel and Thunderstrike, but decades of grievances against the Blackwood family. "Been working these lands since before Richard's daddy owned them," explained Hank Williams to a young reporter whose pressed slacks and polished shoes marked him as an outsider. "Blackwood's always treated animals like machines, and people like animals. About time someone stood up to them." Inside the stable, Miguel hadn't left Thunderstrike's side all night. The stallion remained unusually alert, his ears constantly swiveling toward the doors and windows, muscles tense beneath his gleaming black coat. He sensed the abnormal energy surrounding the farm, and only Miguel's quiet presence kept him from panicking. "It's okay, amigo," Miguel whispered, running his hands along the horse's powerful neck. "I won't let them take you." Tom Johnson appeared at the stall door, his expression grave. "Richards called in reinforcements. His lawyer from Omaha just arrived, and there's talk about a court order to remove you from the property." Miguel's stomach tightened, but he maintained a calm exterior for Thunderstrike's sake. The horse immediately picked up on the subtle change in his breathing, nickering softly and pressing his muzzle against the boy's chest. "What can they do?" Miguel asked. "Legally? A lot," Tom admitted. "But something's happening out there that I've never seen before. People who've never spoken up against the Blackwoods are finding their voice." Through the stable window, Miguel could see the growing crowd. Farmers in weathered caps stood alongside store owners in pressed shirts. The Methodist church ladies had set up a table with coffee and homemade pastries for the protesters. Sheriff Johnson's deputies maintained a respectful presence, but their sympathies were clearly with the community rather than with Blackwood. Richard Blackwood emerged from his house, flanked by two men in expensive suits. His face was flushed with rage as he surveyed the spectacle his property had become. Camera crews immediately surged forward, shouting questions that he ignored. "This is private property," he bellowed, pointing at the assembled crowd. "You're all trespassing." Eleanor Jenkins stepped forward, her silver hair catching the morning light. "We're on the county easement, Richard. 15 feet from the road is public right-of-way." She smiled thinly. "I helped draft that ordinance in 1978, if you recall." Frustrated, Blackwood turned to the sheriff. "Arrest that Mexican boy for theft. He's trying to steal my property." Sheriff Johnson sighed, removing his hat. Miguel Ramirez is a legal employee with permission to handle that horse, Richard. Every worker here has confirmed it. There's no theft occurring. As the standoff continued outside, Dwayne Harrington made his way to the stables, his expensive boots carefully avoiding mud puddles. He found Miguel sitting cross-legged in Thunderstrike's stall, the massive stallion standing protectively nearby. "Mind if I watch for a spell?" the Texan asked, keeping his distance. Miguel nodded cautiously. Harrington leaned against the opposite wall, observing the unusual tableau. "Been breeding and showing horses for 40 years, he said finally. "Never seen anything like what you've got with this stallion." Miguel remained silent, his hand resting lightly on Thunderstrike's foreleg. "That horse killed a man in Omaha," Harrington continued. "Not directly, mind you, but the accident happened because he spooked so badly. After that, he injured 6 professional handlers. 1 lost an eye." He chewed thoughtfully on his toothpick. "Yet here he is, gentle as a lamb with you." "He's not gentle with everyone," Miguel corrected. "He's still traumatized. He just trusts me." "And why's that, you reckon?" Miguel considered the question. "Because I never tried to control him. I just gave him space to heal." Harrington nodded slowly. "Worth thinking about." He pushed himself away from the wall. "I'm not in the business of creating more problems for myself, son. Blackwood didn't tell me about the situation here. I'm going to withdraw my offer." The news spread quickly through the farm. Without the imminent sale, Blackwood lost his most pressing reason to separate Miguel and Thunderstrike immediately. But the reprieve was temporary at best. By midday, the crowd had grown even larger. News of the standoff had reached neighboring communities, bringing more supporters. Local businesses closed early, their owners joining the protest. Willow Creek was taking a collective stand against decades of Blackwood's exploitation. Inside his opulent study, Richard Blackwood paced like a caged animal, phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care what it takes," he barked at his lawyer. "Get me a court order to remove that boy from my property and secure my horse." When he emerged again, a new determination hardened his features. He strode directly to the center of the gathered crowd, raising his hands for attention. "This has gone on long enough," he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieted yard. "Let's resolve this once and for all." Eleanor Jenkins moved forward cautiously. "What do you propose, Richard?" "A test," Blackwood declared, a cold smile forming. "If that damned horse is as loyal to the boy as you all believe, let's prove it." His proposal sent murmurs through the crowd. Thunderstrike would be released in the large corral. On one side would stand Miguel. On the other, Blackwood with a bucket of premium oats that the horse had always favored before his trauma. "If the animal goes to the boy, you can have him," Blackwood announced magnanimously. "If he comes to me, this ends now, and the Mexican leaves my property today." "You don't need to do this, Richard," Eleanor warned. "You're exposing yourself to ridicule." "My property, my rules," he replied curtly. Within the hour, the large oval corral had become an impromptu arena. People lined the fence rails, camera crews positioned for the best angle. Miguel stood at one end, his face pale but resolute. Blackwood took his position at the opposite side, holding the bucket of grain with a confident smile. "Horses are predictable," he muttered to his son, who lounged against the fence nearby. "They always choose food over sentiment." Tom Johnson personally led Thunderstrike to the center of the corral. The stallion was fitted with only a light halter, which Tom removed before stepping back. For a moment, the magnificent animal stood motionless, ears alert, assessing the unusual situation and the hundreds of eyes fixed upon him. Blackwood shook the bucket, the sound of oats clearly audible in the tense silence. The smell of the premium grain carried on the light breeze. Thunderstrike's nostrils flared as he caught the familiar scent. He took several steps toward Blackwood, drawn by the remembered treat. A triumphant smile spread across the rancher's face as he rattled the bucket again. Miguel made no movement, called no commands. He stood perfectly still, respecting the horse's freedom to choose. A single tear tracked down his cheek, betraying the emotion he fought to contain. Thunderstrike paused abruptly, Halfway between the two men, he turned his head toward Blackwood, then back toward Miguel. The crowd held its collective breath. What happened next would be recounted in Willow Creek for generations. The stallion, as if making a conscious decision, turned deliberately away from the feed bucket and walked with measured steps toward Miguel. Upon reaching the boy, the magnificent animal lowered his head and gently pressed his muzzle against Miguel's chest in an almost human gesture of affection. The silence shattered as spontaneous applause erupted from the onlookers. Even some of Blackwood's remaining loyal hands couldn't suppress smiles at the unequivocal display of connection. Richard Blackwood's face flushed deep crimson. The bucket slipped from his fingers, premium oats spilling across the dirt, ignored completely by the horse that once would have fought for such a treat. Dwayne Harrington stepped into the corral, ceremoniously removing his Stetson. With deliberate movements, he withdrew the sales contract from his jacket pocket and tore it in half before the assembled crowd. "Never seen anything like this in 40 years breeding horses," the Texan declared, extending his hand to Miguel. "You have a gift, son, if you ever want a real job." Eleanor Jenkins moved forward, her judicial authority evident in her bearing despite the informal setting. "Richard Blackwood, in light of public testimony and the evidence presented, this informal but morally valid tribunal declares that Thunderstrike no longer belongs to you." "This is absurd," Blackwood protested, his voice cracking. "You can't simply take my property." "Actually, I can propose a legal solution," interjected Jason Morris, the young lawyer who had recently arrived in town. His Harvard education seemed at odds with his genuine commitment to rural justice. As compensation for Miguel's years of unpaid labor, for the emotional damage caused to the Johnson family, and considering the current market value of the animal that Mr. Ramirez rehabilitated from an unsalvageable state, I propose a transfer of ownership as an out-of-court settlement. Jason adjusted his glasses before delivering the final blow. That, or face a very public lawsuit for all the violations we've documented. Blackwood's gaze darted around the corral, searching for allies and finding none. The political connections he'd cultivated for decades were suddenly silent, afraid of association with the public relations disaster unfolding in real time on local television. As Thunderstrike stood protectively beside Miguel, nuzzling the boy's shoulder with gentle affection, the crowd's applause swelled again. The image, captured by news cameras and cell phones, would appear on front pages across the state. A boy and a horse, two abandoned souls who had found in each other the acceptance the world had denied them both. While the crowd exploded in applause and even some of Blackwood's foremen couldn't contain emotional smiles, Dwayne Harrington publicly tore up the purchase contract and approached Miguel. "Never seen anything like this in 40 years raising horses, son." But the real test was only beginning, as Richard Blackwood was not a man to accept defeat. Richard Blackwood stood frozen in the center of the corral, the spilled oats at his feet a testament to his humiliation. The jubilant sounds of the crowd seemed distant to him, muffled by the roaring in his ears as decades of unchallenged authority crumbled before his eyes. For a moment, something almost human flickered across his face, perhaps recognition that he had fundamentally misunderstood something essential about the world. The moment passed quickly. Blackwood's features hardened into the cold mask of entitlement that had served him for 63 years. "This farce changes nothing," he announced, his voice cutting through the celebratory atmosphere. "A theatrical display doesn't alter legal ownership. That animal remains my property under Nebraska law." Eleanor Jenkins stepped forward, her judicial authority evident even in her casual attire. "The court of public opinion has rendered its verdict, Richard. Sometimes wisdom precedes the law." "I don't recognize backyard tribunals," Blackwood snapped, "and I don't negotiate with children or animals." Jason Morris, the Harvard-educated lawyer who had chosen Willow Creek over corporate firms that had courted him, moved to Eleanor's side. His youth and idealism were balanced by a razor-sharp legal mind. "Mr. Blackwood," he began calmly, "we've documented numerous labor violations involving minors, including Miguel. The hours worked, compensation denied, hazardous conditions, all would make fascinating reading for the Labor Department." Blackwood scoffed, empty threats from a boy playing lawyer. Perhaps, Morris continued unfazed, but the 27 signed affidavits regarding animal cruelty might interest state authorities. Or the tax discrepancies in your breeding program records that Sheriff Johnson noticed. Curious how the values reported to insurance differ from those claimed as business losses. The color drained from Blackwood's face. You're blackmailing me. I'm proposing a settlement, Morris corrected. One that keeps your broader affairs private while resolving this specific situation. Legal transfer of the horse to Miguel as compensation for documented wrongs. Simple, clean, and remarkably generous, considering the alternatives. As the negotiations continued in Blackwood's study, Miguel remained in the corral with Thunderstrike. The stallion stood relaxed beside him, occasionally lowering his head to nuzzle the boy's shoulder or hair. To onlookers, it appeared the horse was comforting Miguel rather than the reverse. He knows what's happening, Martha Johnson remarked softly to Tom as they watched from the fence. That animal understands exactly what today means for both of them. Tom nodded, his weathered face showing rare emotion. Never seen anything like it in 40 years working horses. It's like they're having a conversation none of us can hear. Inside the oak-paneled study, Blackwood sat behind his massive desk, surrounded by attorneys summoned from Omaha. The trappings of wealth, hunting trophies, expensive artwork, leather-bound books never read, contrasted sharply with the simple determination of Eleanor Jenkins and Jason Morris seated opposite him. This is highway robbery, Blackwood fumed, jabbing his finger at the settlement papers. That horse cost $500,000 and was deemed unsalvageable by every professional trainer you hired, Eleanor countered. Its only value now exists because of Miguel's work. Work I paid him for. Jason Morris raised an eyebrow. According to payroll records, Miguel received room and board in exchange for 60-hour work weeks. No salary, no benefits, no education provision despite his minor status. He opened a folder. Nebraska labor laws regarding minor workers are quite specific, Mr. Blackwood. The penalties for violations, even more so. Outside, the crowd had transformed from protesters to celebrants. Tables appeared with potluck dishes. Children played tag between clusters of adults sharing stories about the Blackwoods' decades of exploitation. What had begun as support for Miguel and Thunderstrike had evolved into a community reclaiming its dignity. Miguel sat alone on a hay bale, watching the proceedings with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Thunderstrike grazed nearby, seemingly unconcerned with the commotion, though his ears remained alert to Miguel's position at all times. Pretty amazing what you've done. Miguel looked up to find Richard Blackwood Jr. standing before him, an unreadable expression on his handsome face. I'm just taking care of him, Miguel replied cautiously. Junior studied the stallion, then Miguel. You know, I tried to ride him when he first arrived. Thought I'd show everyone how it's done. He gave a humorless laugh. Landed flat on my back in 10 seconds. Dad was furious. Something almost vulnerable crossed Junior's face, a glimpse of the boy beneath the bully. How'd you do it? Get him to trust you like that? Miguel considered the question. I didn't try to make him do anything. Just showed him I wasn't a threat. That simple, huh? Junior scoffed, but there was less venom in his voice than usual. Not simple, just different. Miguel stood slowly. Why do you hate us so much? The workers, I mean. Junior's expression closed like a door slamming shut. I don't hate anyone. I just understand how the world works. There are people who own things and people who work for them. Dad taught me that. And which one are you happier being? Miguel asked quietly. Before Junior could answer, a commotion from the main house drew their attention. The door had opened, and Richard Blackwood emerged with Eleanor Jenkins and the attorneys. The crowd quieted, tension returning to the air. Inside Thunderstrike's mind, the shift in energy was immediately apparent. The stallion raised his head from grazing, nostrils flaring as he processed the emotional tenor of the humans surrounding him. Over months, he had learned to categorize people by their energy rather than just their appearance. Miguel felt safe. His presence created a bubble of calm that allowed Thunderstrike's traumatized nervous system to settle. The Johnson family registered as non-threatening, but Blackwood emanated the same predatory intensity that Thunderstrike associated with pain, confinement, and fear. The horse moved deliberately to Miguel's side, positioning himself between the boy and the approaching group. It wasn't aggression, but protection, a conscious choice to shield the human who had shown him patience when others had shown only force. "We have reached an agreement," Eleanor announced to the assembled community. "In recognition of certain claims and as settlement for potential litigation, Mr. Blackwood has agreed to transfer ownership of Thunderstrike to Miguel Ramirez." A cheer erupted from the crowd, but Eleanor raised her hand for silence. "Additionally," she continued, "Mr. Blackwood will donate 20 acres of the eastern property and provide initial funding for the establishment of a rehabilitation center for traumatized horses to be overseen by a community board." The stunned silence that followed was broken by Martha Johnson's clear voice. "And the children? What about what happened to our boys?" Eleanor nodded toward Richard Jr., who stood awkwardly at the edge of the gathering. "Mr. Blackwood's son has agreed to community service hours working with the county youth program and to personally apologize to the children involved." Blackwood himself remained stone-faced throughout the announcement, his eyes fixed on a point above the crowd's heads. The public capitulation clearly pained him more than the financial concessions. When the formal part concluded, he turned without a word and strode back into his house, the heavy door closing with finality behind him. That evening, as the impromptu celebration continued with a bonfire and music, Miguel sat alone with Thunderstrike on a small hill overlooking the farm. The stallion grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally raising his head to check on Miguel's position. "I still can't believe it," Miguel said softly in Spanish. "You're really mine now, officially. No one can separate us." Thunderstrike abandoned his grazing to approach, lowering his massive head to Miguel's level. The horse's dark eyes reflected the distant bonfire, pools of intelligence that seemed to understand every word. "I wonder if we should leave this place," Miguel continued, running his hand along the horse's sleek neck. "Too many bad memories for both of us." "There you are." Tom Johnson's voice came from behind them. "Everyone's looking for the guests of honor." Miguel smiled. "We needed some quiet. It's been a lot for him to process." Tom nodded, settling beside Miguel on the grass. "Martha sent me up with this. Said you probably haven't eaten all day." He offered a plate of food that Miguel accepted gratefully. They sat in companionable silence as Miguel ate, watching the celebration below. Finally, Tom spoke. "What are your plans now, son?" Miguel looked up, surprised. "Plans? You're a horse owner now. Got settlement money coming. World's opening up for you." The possibility of choice, of a future determined by his own decisions rather than necessity, felt foreign to Miguel. For 10 years, survival had been his only plan. "I don't know," he admitted. "I never thought past trying to keep Thunderstrike safe." Tom nodded. Eleanor mentioned something about a program at the community college, equine therapy certification, said she'd help with the paperwork. He paused. "And we've got that 20 acres to develop. Someone's going to need to run that rehabilitation center." Miguel stared at the older man. "You think that could be me? I don't have any qualifications." Tom gestured toward Thunderstrike, who had returned to grazing nearby, completely at ease despite the distant crowd. "You've got the only qualification that matters. You understand them." He stood, brushing grass from his jeans. "Just think about it." As Tom headed back toward the celebration, Miguel remained on the hillside, the future suddenly vast with possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. Beside him, Thunderstrike dozed lightly, his massive body relaxed in a way that would have seemed impossible months earlier. The following morning, Miguel was leading Thunderstrike on their usual dawn walk when Richard Blackwood appeared at the edge of the paddock. The stallion immediately tensed, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring at the man's scent. "Easy," Miguel soothed, placing a reassuring hand on the horse's neck. To Blackwood, he simply nodded, wary of the man's intentions. "The papers are signed," Blackwood said without preamble. "He's legally yours now." He held out a thick envelope. This contains his registration documents, medical history, and breeding papers, worth a small fortune on their own. Miguel accepted the envelope cautiously. "Thank you." Blackwood's gaze shifted to Thunderstrike, who remained alert, but no longer aggressive. "You know, I still don't understand it. What you did that none of my trainers could do." While the attorneys debated in legal terms, Eleanor Jenkins silenced the room with a simple question. "Richard, have you ever considered the real cost of winning this battle?" And for the first time, the most powerful man in Willow Creek realized that some victories can destroy everything one has built. Eleanor's question hung in the air like the Nebraska dust on a dry summer afternoon. Richard Blackwood stood motionless by the window of his study, his back to the assembled group of lawyers, community leaders, and journalists. For a fleeting moment, he seemed diminished, a man confronting not just legal challenges but the edifice of his life's meaning. The transformation of Willow Creek in the days following the Corral Showdown was swift and stunning. Local newspapers that had once carefully avoided criticizing the Blackwood family now featured bold headlines. "Local teens bond with killer horse exposes pattern of abuse." The Omaha World Herald sent investigative reporters who uncovered tax discrepancies in Blackwood's business dealings. Former employees, emboldened by the community's stand, came forward with stories of exploitation that stretched back decades. Miguel watched this unfolding from a strange new position, no longer invisible, but uncomfortably visible. Strangers stopped him in town to shake his hand. Children asked for his autograph as if he were a celebrity. The attention made him pull his hat lower, duck his shoulders, and seek refuge in the one place that still made sense: Thunderstrike's stall. "They don't really see me," he confided to the stallion one morning as he brushed the gleaming black coat. "They see what they want to see, some kind of hero." Thunderstrike's ears flickered back and forth, catching Miguel's words. Over their months together, the horse had developed an uncanny ability to track Miguel's emotional state. When the boy's voice dropped low with uncertainty, the stallion would press his massive head against Miguel's chest, offering a physical anchor that steadied them both. In the Johnson kitchen, Miguel stared at the stack of newspapers Martha had collected. His own face looked back at him from grainy photos, always with Thunderstrike nearby. The headlines tracked Blackwood's falling fortunes. State Agriculture Department launches investigation into Blackwood Farms. Senator disavows connection to embattled rancher. Stock values plummet as investors distance themselves from controversy. "Never thought I'd see the day," Tom remarked, pouring coffee for himself and Martha. "Richard's been untouchable my whole life, his father before him. Now look." Miguel pushed the papers away. "I didn't want to destroy him. I just wanted to save Thunderstrike." Martha placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You didn't destroy anything, Miguel. Richard Blackwood has been tearing things down his whole life. People, animals, the land itself. All you did was make it visible." Outside the Johnsons' modest home, the world was reorganizing itself around the new reality. The Department of Agriculture inspectors moved methodically through the Blackwood properties, documenting conditions and interviewing workers. Political allies who had once eagerly accepted Blackwood's campaign contributions now returned his calls through assistance or not at all. "It's the definition of a pariah," Jason Morris explained to Miguel as they walked the perimeter of the 20 acres that would soon house the rehabilitation center. Once someone becomes toxic, the powerful abandon them to protect themselves. Miguel listened, but his focus was on Thunderstrike, who walked beside them without a lead rope, choosing to stay close. The stallion had grown increasingly comfortable with Jason's presence, though he still maintained a cautious distance from most humans. "The funny thing is," Jason continued, "most of what's happening to Blackwood isn't even about the horse anymore. Once people started looking closely, they found all sorts of irregularities. It's like pulling a loose thread and watching the whole sweater unravel. At night, when exhaustion finally overcame him, Miguel's sleep was fragmented by nightmares. Thunderstrike being taken away, locked in dark trailers, surrounded by men with whips. He would wake gasping, instinctively reaching for his boots to check on the horse. Martha began leaving sandwiches wrapped in wax paper on his bedside table, knowing he would make these midnight pilgrimages regardless of her protests. The stallion seemed to share Miguel's unease. Previously content to doze through the night, Thunderstrike now remained alert during Miguel's absences, ears pricked toward the door, nickering softly when the boy appeared. Only when Miguel settled on the hay bale beside his stall would the great animal relax enough to lower his head and close his eyes. "You two need each other," Eleanor Jenkins observed one morning. Finding Miguel asleep against the stall door, Thunderstrike standing guard over him. "This isn't just about saving him anymore. He's saving you right back." Miguel didn't respond, but the truth of her words settled in him like a stone dropping through clear water. Along the fence of what would become the rehabilitation center, children from town began leaving drawings, crude crayon sketches of a black horse and a boy, surrounded by hearts and stars. Some included notes in childish handwriting: "Miguel and Thunder, friends forever. Horses have feelings too. Be kind to animals." Martha collected these offerings each evening, carefully pressing them between the pages of a leather-bound book. "For when you're older," she told Miguel, "to remember how many people stood with you." As Blackwood watched his empire crumbling, something shifted in his approach. The aggressive legal maneuvers ceased. The threats against Miguel and the Johnsons stopped appearing in certified letters. Instead, a strange silence emanated from the main house, broken only by the occasional arrival and departure of expensive cars with out-of-state plates. "He's liquidating assets," Tom reported after speaking with other ranch foremen in the area, "selling off parcels to cover legal fees and shore up the main business operations." One cold evening, as Miguel completed Thunderstrike's final grooming of the day, he sensed a presence at the stable door. Turning, he found Richard Blackwood standing in the shadows, watching silently. The stallion immediately tensed, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the man who represented danger in his memory. "Easy," Miguel murmured, placing a calming hand on Thunderstrike's neck. To Blackwood, he simply nodded, wary but not hostile. "May I come in?" Blackwood asked, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Miguel hesitated, feeling Thunderstrike's muscles bunching beneath his palm. He's still nervous around strangers, especially after everything that's happened. Blackwood remained at the threshold, making no move to enter without permission, a small but significant concession from a man accustomed to owning every space he occupied. "I've been watching you with him," Blackwood said finally, "from my study window. Every morning at dawn, every evening at sunset." Miguel continued brushing Thunderstrike, maintaining the calming rhythm that soothed them both. "My father broke horses like he broke men," Blackwood continued, his gaze fixed on some middle distance. "It was the only method we knew. You make them fear you more than they fear anything else. Then they obey." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of generations of cruelty justified as necessity. "That's not the only way," Miguel said quietly. "Evidently not." Blackwood gestured toward Thunderstrike, who remained alert but no longer poised to flee. "What you've done with him, I didn't think it was possible." Miguel set the brush down and faced Blackwood directly. "Why are you here, sir?" The older man's composure faltered briefly. In the dim, stable light, the lines of his face seemed deeper, his shoulders less square than Miguel remembered. "I'm not sure," Blackwood admitted. "Maybe to understand something before it's too late." Without warning, Thunderstrike took a step forward, then another, moving deliberately toward Blackwood. Miguel held his breath, ready to intervene if necessary, but something in the stallion's body language suggested curiosity rather than aggression. "Don't move," Miguel instructed softly. "Let him come to you." Blackwood stood frozen as the massive black horse approached, nostrils flaring as he took in the man's scent. For a long moment, horse and man regarded each other, predator and prey, owner and owned, now meeting as equals for the first time. "He's reading you," Miguel explained. "Your energy, your intentions." "What should I do?" Blackwood asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just breathe. Don't try to touch him. Let him decide." The stallion stretched his neck forward, still maintaining a safe distance, ears flicking back and forth as he processed this new interaction. After what seemed an eternity, Thunderstrike snorted softly and took a half-step back, neither accepting nor rejecting, but acknowledging Blackwood's presence without fear. "That's remarkable," Blackwood murmured. "He hated me before." "He feared you," Miguel corrected. "There's a difference." The exchange seemed to affect Blackwood deeply. He watched as Thunderstrike returned to Miguel's side, seeking the comfort of familiar touch. "Would you—" Blackwood began, then paused, as if the words were difficult to form. "Would you show me how you communicate with him?" The request hung in the air between them, not an order from employer to worker, but a genuine question from one human to another. Miguel considered it carefully, weighing his instinct to protect Thunderstrike against the possibility of something healing in this unexpected moment. "I could show you some basics," he said finally, "but you'd need to follow my lead exactly. No shortcuts." The next morning, before dawn, Miguel found Blackwood waiting at the stable, dressed not in his usual tailored clothes, but in simple work attire. The transformation was jarring. Without the trappings of wealth, he seemed older, more human. "First rule," Miguel said without preamble, "is that we move at his pace, not ours." For an hour, he demonstrated the foundations of his approach: how to telegraph movements before making them, how to read the subtle signals in ear position and muscle tension, how to offer choice rather than demand compliance. Blackwood listened with uncharacteristic humility, asking questions that revealed both his ignorance and his genuine desire to understand. When Miguel finally guided Blackwood's hand to touch Thunderstrike's neck, the stallion accepting the contact with cautious tolerance, something shifted in the older man's expression. A lifetime of seeing horses as commodities, as machines for profit or pleasure, cracked open to reveal a glimpse of something else. Recognition of another conscious being with fears, preferences, and dignity. Alone in the library of his mansion, Blackwood stared at the family photographs lining the walls. 3 generations of Blackwood standing proudly beside hunting trophies and prize-winning horses, all conquered through dominance and force. For the first time, he saw these images not as testaments to strength, but as documentation of a fundamental misunderstanding of power. Alone in his library, Blackwood looked distractedly at his family photographs lining the walls. What had always seemed like evidence of strength now looked different to him. 3 generations of Blackwoods posed with trophies from hunts and competitions, the symbols of dominion suddenly hollow. "Quero que você me ensine, Miguel, não apenas sobre cavalos, mas sobre essa conexão que nunca entendi." And in this unlikely request, a bridge began to form over the abyss that separated 2 worlds. "I want you to teach me, Miguel. Not just about horses, but about this connection I've never understood." Richard Blackwood's words emerged with evident difficulty, as if each syllable required him to dismantle a lifetime of certainties. Miguel studied the older man's face, searching for any trace of manipulation or deceit. Instead, he found something he'd never associated with Blackwood before: vulnerability. 3 days later, a historic agreement was signed in Eleanor Jenkins' office downtown. The small law practice had never hosted such a significant gathering. County officials, journalists, community leaders, and the unlikely pair at the center of it all: Miguel Ramirez and Richard Blackwood. Miguel's hands trembled slightly as he signed the documents transferring ownership of Thunderstrike. Despite the public victory in the corral and the verbal agreements, some part of him had feared a last-minute reversal. Only when his signature dried on the final page did he allow himself to fully exhale. "Congratulations, Mr. Ramirez," Jason Morris said, offering his hand across the table. "Thunderstrike is officially yours." The formal declaration brought unexpected tears to Miguel's eyes. His journey from orphaned stablehand to legal owner of the magnificent stallion seemed impossible, yet the papers before him confirmed its reality. Blackwood's signature followed, his fountain pen moving with resigned efficiency across the pages, transferring 20 acres of prime eastern property for the rehabilitation center. His face remained impassive, but his hand betrayed a slight tremor that only Miguel seemed to notice. "The funds for initial construction will be transferred by the end of the week," Blackwood stated, his voice betraying no emotion. "My attorneys will handle the particulars." Eleanor Jenkins, looking more formidable than ever in her judicial attire, completed the witness signatures. "This settlement represents more than legal transfer of property," she announced to the assembled group. "It acknowledges the value of compassion over control, of healing over dominance." Outside, a small crowd had gathered to witness the conclusion of what locals were now calling the Willow Creek Revolt. When Miguel emerged from the building, spontaneous applause erupted. Children waved handmade signs decorated with horse silhouettes. Elderly residents who rarely left their homes had been driven into town specifically for this moment. "Speech! Speech!" someone called, but Miguel shook his head, uncomfortable with the attention. Tom Johnson stepped forward protectively, his arm around the boy's shoulders. "Miguel lets his actions speak for him," Tom announced to the crowd, "and there'll be plenty to see once the center opens. Now let's give him some peace." That evening, Miguel sat on a hay bale outside Thunderstrike's stall, trying to process the day's events. The stallion moved restlessly inside, picking up on Miguel's tumultuous emotions. "It's really happening, amigo," Miguel whispered in Spanish, reaching through the bars to stroke the velvet muzzle that pressed against his palm. "No one can take you away now, and we're going to help other horses too." Thunderstrike blew softly through his nostrils, the warm breath ruffling Miguel's hair. Over their months together, these quiet conversations had become a ritual. Miguel speaking his thoughts aloud, the horse responding with subtle shifts in posture and breath that felt remarkably like dialogue. "You know what's strange?" Miguel continued. "When I first came here after my parents died, I thought I'd never belong anywhere again. Now look at us." The sound of approaching footsteps caused Thunderstrike to raise his head alertly. Martha Johnson appeared, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the basket beside Miguel. "It's been quite a day." The warm scent of fresh bread and chicken stew filled the stable air. Miguel hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment. "The whole town's talking about nothing else," Martha continued, settling beside him. "Eleanor says there's already been calls from other counties asking about your methods for working with traumatized horses." Miguel paused mid-bite. "My methods? That's what they're calling it now. The Ramirez method." Martha smiled at his confusion. "Don't look so surprised. What you've done with Thunderstrike isn't just luck, Miguel. It's something special." The following morning, Nancy Redfield arrived with a stack of college catalogs. The retired librarian had taken it upon herself to research educational opportunities for Miguel. "The University of Nebraska has an excellent equine science program," she explained, spreading the materials across the Johnsons' kitchen table. "And with Eleanor's connections, we can arrange for your high school equivalency test next month." Miguel stared at the glossy pages showing smiling students in laboratories and on horseback. College had never seemed a possibility for him, an undocumented orphan with no formal education beyond 7th grade. "I can't afford this," he said softly. "That's already been addressed," Nancy replied matter-of-factly. "Eleanor has established a scholarship fund. Several local businesses have contributed, and—" She hesitated. Richard Blackwood made a significant donation himself. Miguel's surprise must have shown on his face because Nancy added, "People are complicated, Miguel. Even Blackwood." As winter settled over Nebraska, transforming the landscape into a monochrome of whites and grays, activity on the eastern property intensified. Architects visited with blueprints, contractors surveyed the land, and Tom Johnson, newly appointed as manager of the Future Center, spent hours discussing facility designs that would best serve traumatized horses. "We'll need special stalls with rounded corners," Miguel explained during one planning session. "Sharp angles can trigger flight responses in horses that have been confined traumatically." Tom nodded, making notes. "And the lighting? Natural whenever possible. Fluorescence can cause stress. The flickering bothers them, even though we can't see it." These conversations revealed how much knowledge Miguel had accumulated through observation and intuition. Wisdom gained not from textbooks but from countless hours of patient connection with Thunderstrike and other horses. "I never thought I'd end my career doing something this meaningful," Tom admitted one evening as they walked the snow-covered property, stakes and strings marking where buildings would soon rise. Spent 30 years working other men's land, following other men's orders. Miguel understood. His own transformation from invisible laborer to respected expert still felt surreal, a dream he might wake from at any moment. The most unexpected development came one frozen December morning when a black Range Rover pulled up to the Johnsons' modest home. Richard Blackwood emerged, carrying rolled blueprints under his arm. "May I come in?" he asked when Miguel answered the door, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. At the kitchen table, Blackwood unrolled the plans. "I've made some modifications to the center design," he explained, pointing to detailed renderings. "If you approve." The changes were substantial: expanded pasture access, a covered round pen for year-round work, improved water systems, all improvements that would benefit the horses but would also significantly increase costs. "This is more than we discussed," Miguel said cautiously. Blackwood nodded. "I'll cover the difference. Consider it an investment in getting this right." Later that week, trucks began arriving with donated equipment, modern stalls, specialized veterinary supplies, office furniture. Each delivery bore a simple card: "Contribution from Blackwood Enterprises." "What's he playing at?" Tom wondered aloud as they watched workers unload state-of-the-art horse handling equipment. "Richard doesn't do anything without an angle." Miguel wasn't sure himself, but he recalled the expression on Blackwood's face when Thunderstrike had first approached him voluntarily, a mixture of awe and regret that suggested something fundamental shifting in the man's understanding. As word spread about the center's development, volunteers began appearing, retired farmers offering labor, teenagers asking to help with construction on weekends, women from town organizing fundraisers for operating costs. What had begun as Miguel's private struggle to save one horse had blossomed into a community endeavor. One particularly cold afternoon, Miguel was showing a group of high school students the property when he noticed a familiar figure standing awkwardly at the edge of the gathering. Richard Blackwood Jr. had returned to Willow Creek, though the circumstances remained unclear. After the tour concluded, Jr. approached, hands thrust deep into the pockets of his expensive coat. "Got a minute?" he asked, his usual arrogance noticeably absent. They walked in silence along the perimeter of what would become the main paddock. Finally, Junior spoke. "I've been doing some thinking since everything happened." Miguel waited, remembering Lucas's bruised face and Billy's bloody nose. "What I did to your brothers was wrong," Junior continued, the words evidently difficult for him. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to say it to your face. I'm sorry." The apology hung between them, fragile as breath in winter air. "Why tell me?" Miguel asked. "Lucas and Billy are the ones you hurt." "I'm going to talk to them too," Junior assured him. "But you were the one who stood up for them when no one else would, even knowing what my father could do to your family." Something in Junior's demeanor had changed, the entitled swagger replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful presence. "Dad's selling the rest of the farm," he added after a moment. "Moving to Arizona for his health, he says. But really, I think he can't face being here anymore." The news surprised Miguel. Despite everything, he couldn't imagine Willow Creek without the Blackwood presence that had defined it for generations. As preparations for the center's official launch intensified, local media coverage expanded beyond Nebraska. A television crew from Denver arrived to film a segment about the horse that changed a town, interviewing residents about the Blackwood Farm's transformation and the community's newfound solidarity. "In all my years reporting, I've rarely seen a small town come together like this," the anchorwoman commented during her stand-up in front of the partially constructed center. "From the ashes of exploitation has risen something remarkable, a place dedicated to healing the wounds of these magnificent animals." On the morning of the groundbreaking ceremony, Miguel woke before dawn as usual, drawn to Thunderstrike's stable by the invisible thread that connected them. The stallion greeted him with a soft nicker, pushing his muzzle against Miguel's chest in their familiar ritual of recognition. "Today's the big day, amigo," Miguel whispered, pressing his forehead against Thunderstrike's. "Everything is changing because of you." While the stallion enjoyed his morning feed, Miguel noticed a small envelope that had been slipped under the stable door. Inside was a note in Martha's handwriting, "For your future," and a newspaper clipping about veterinary school scholarships specifically for students focusing on equine trauma rehabilitation. At that moment, surrounded by the quiet breathing of the animal who had transformed his life, Miguel allowed himself to see beyond the immediate victory to a future shaped by purpose rather than survival. The journey that had begun with fear and isolation had opened into a path of possibility that neither he nor Thunderstrike could have imagined in their darkest moments. While the crowd applauded enthusiastically, Miguel leaned forward and whispered in Thunderstrike's ear, "My mother was right, amigo. When we learn to truly look, we're never alone again." And in that moment, he knew that the journey that began with fear and solitude had transformed into something much greater than himself. 5 years passed like the seasons across the Nebraska plains, gradually yet inexorably transforming everything they touched. The dilapidated eastern acreage of the former Blackwood property had blossomed into the Ramirez Equine Recovery Center. Its modern facilities nestled harmoniously into the rolling landscape as if they had always belonged there. On a crisp autumn morning, Miguel stood in the center's main paddock, watching a new arrival, a chestnut mare with haunted eyes and quivering flanks. Her ribs showed through her dull coat, and a network of old whip scars crisscrossed her hindquarters. She paced the perimeter frantically, stopping occasionally to stare at Miguel with wide, distrustful eyes. "This one reminds me of you when you first arrived," Miguel said softly to Thunderstrike, who stood beside him, his coat gleaming black in the morning sun. At 12 years old, the stallion had developed a few silver hairs around his muzzle, but remained powerful and alert. The white lightning mark on his chest seemed even more pronounced against his dark coat. Thunderstrike watched the mare with intelligent eyes, his ears flicking back and forth as if understanding exactly what Miguel meant. Over the years, their communication had evolved into something that visitors found uncanny, a wordless dialogue of subtle gestures, breathing patterns, and minute shifts in posture that allowed them to work in perfect synchrony. "Dr. Ramirez?" A voice called from the observation deck, where 3 veterinary students waited with clipboards. "Should we document her initial behavior patterns now?" Miguel nodded, still observing the mare. His University of Nebraska diploma hung in his office, evidence of 4 years of determined study while simultaneously building the center's reputation. What had begun as intuition was now reinforced with scientific understanding of equine psychology and physiology, making the Ramirez method sought after by experts across the country. "Note her eye movement patterns," Miguel instructed the students. "See how she never fully turns her back to us? Classic hypervigilance from sustained abuse. And watch her right front hoof. She's favoring it slightly but trying to hide the weakness." The mare suddenly bolted across the paddock, then froze, trembling violently as a truck rumbled past on the distant road. Thunderstrike remained steady beside Miguel, a living example of what recovery could look like. "Will you use music therapy with this one?" asked Aisha, the most promising of the students. "We'll see what she responds to," Miguel replied. "Every horse speaks a different language of trauma. Our job is to learn to listen." Inside the main building, the center hummed with purposeful activity. The reception area walls displayed before and after photographs of their success stories. Horses that had arrived broken in body and spirit, now showing clear-eyed confidence in their rehabilitation photos. Alongside these hung children's drawings, thank you letters from owners, and scientific journal articles validating the center's approaches. Tom Johnson emerged from his office, moving more slowly these days, but with the same quiet dignity that had sustained Miguel throughout his childhood. At 62, Tom had transitioned from hands-on management to administrative director, overseeing the center's expanding programs with pride. "The school group from Lincoln just called," he informed Miguel. "Bus broke down. They'll be an hour late." "That gives us time to settle the new mare," Miguel replied. "How did the fundraiser go last night?" Tom's face brightened. exceeded the goal by 30%. Martha's apple pies at the auction went for $300 each. Martha Johnson's bakery in town had become a Willow Creek institution. What began as a small storefront now employed 5 local women and supplied pastries to cafes as far away as Omaha. Her Thunderstrike cookies, black shortbread with a white lightning bolt of icing, were particularly popular with tourists who came to see the famous horse and his remarkable handler. The center had transformed Willow Creek's economy along with its spirit. Where once stood a single diner and a struggling general store, the main street now boasted a cafe, 2 bed and breakfasts, and shops selling locally made crafts. Families that had considered leaving the dying agricultural town now found reasons to stay, with the center providing stable employment and the increased tourism supporting new businesses. As Miguel completed his morning rounds, checking on each of the 12 horses currently in rehabilitation, a familiar silver Lincoln pulled into the parking area. Eleanor Jenkins, now well into her 80s but still sharp as a winter wind, made her weekly visit to the center she had helped create. "The mare from the Kansas rescue arrived, I see," she noted as Miguel helped her from her car. Eleanor refused to use a wheelchair, preferring a handcrafted cane topped with a silver horse head. "Reminds me of that Appaloosa we got in the 2nd year, the one they said would never let a human touch her again." Miguel smiled at the memory. "Starlight. She's working with therapy patients in Colorado now." They walked slowly through the facility, Eleanor nodding approvingly at the immaculate conditions and innovative features, many of which had been her suggestions during the planning phase. The covered round pen allowed work during Nebraska's harsh winters. The specialized hydrotherapy pool helped horses recovering from physical injuries. The graduated paddock system created safe spaces for increasing levels of socialization. "Richard called yesterday," Eleanor mentioned casually as they reached the observation room overlooking the indoor arena. "Said the Arizona sanctuary is doing well. Asked about Thunderstrike." Miguel nodded, unsurprised. Though Richard Blackwood had sold his Nebraska holdings and relocated permanently to Arizona, he maintained a distant but consistent interest in the center's progress. The occasional checks he sent, always generous, always accompanied by brief formal notes, suggested a complex mix of atonement and genuine evolution in his understanding of his former property and the animals he had once viewed solely as investments. Richard Blackwood Jr.'s transformation had been more dramatic and direct. After his initial awkward apologies to Lucas and Billy, he had surprised everyone by enrolling in courses at the community college. Now, 5 years later, he worked 3 days a week at the center, specializing in equine-assisted therapy for troubled teenagers. Through the window, Miguel could see Junior now, working patiently with a 14-year-old boy whose juvenile record included arson and assault. Together, they were grooming a dappled gray gelding that had once been so aggressive no one could enter his stall. "Some healing goes both ways," Eleanor observed, following Miguel's gaze. The center's most popular public event was the 4th of July demonstration, which had grown from a small local gathering to an attraction drawing visitors from across the Midwest. As afternoon approached, Miguel retreated to the quiet of Thunderstrike's special paddock to prepare the stallion for their performance. Unlike the early days when the horse would tolerate only Miguel's touch, Thunderstrike now accepted a small circle of trusted humans, though he still communicated his preferences clearly, moving away from anyone whose energy felt threatening or whose touch lacked respect. "Ready for our big show, old friend?" Miguel murmured, as he brushed the gleaming coat with long, gentle strokes. Thunderstrike leaned slightly into the brush, eyelids lowering in contentment. 5 years together, officially. Though I think we've been together much longer in the ways that matter. The stallion's ears flicked back and forth, catching Miguel's words. Over time, Miguel had come to understand that Thunderstrike processed human speech not just as sound, but as an emotional current, responding to the feeling beneath the words rather than their literal meaning. As the afternoon progressed, the center filled with visitors. Families spread blankets on the viewing hills. Children clutched Thunderstrike plush toys sold to support the center's rescue fund. Local vendors set up booths selling food and crafts. What had begun as Miguel's private struggle had become a community celebration of transformation and resilience. The highlight of the event was always the same: Miguel and Thunderstrike demonstrating their extraordinary connection through a choreographed demonstration that involved no tack, no commands, only the invisible thread of mutual trust they had woven between them over years of patient communication. As they entered the main arena to enthusiastic applause, Miguel felt Thunderstrike's body shift beneath him, muscles tensing slightly in awareness of the crowd, then relaxing as the stallion registered the familiar setting and routine. Without saddle or bridle, Miguel guided him using only subtle shifts in his own body weight and occasional whispered words in the mixture of English and Spanish that had become their private language. They moved through a series of increasingly complex maneuvers, changes of direction, collected gaits, and finally a demonstration of liberty work where Thunderstrike moved independently around the arena, responding to Miguel's gestures from the center. Behind them, a procession of children from the center's therapeutic riding program entered the arena on horses that had once been considered dangerous or worthless. 10-year-old Alyssa, who hadn't spoken for a year after witnessing domestic violence, rode a former racetrack failure. David, whose autism made traditional classrooms overwhelming, sat confidently atop a mare rescued from slaughter. Each pairing represented a dual healing, child and horse finding in each other a path toward trust and communication. Tom Johnson, watching from the announcer's stand, couldn't hide the pride in his voice as he narrated the procession for the audience. Beside him, Martha wiped tears from her eyes, remembering the frightened boy who had arrived on their doorstep more than 15 years ago, carrying the weight of orphanhood and alienation. When the demonstration concluded, the applause was thunderous. Miguel dismounted fluidly, standing beside Thunderstrike with one hand resting lightly on the stallion's powerful neck. For a moment he was transported back to that first night in the isolated stall. A terrified 17-year-old boy facing a traumatized horse, neither believing they had a future worth living. After the visitors departed and the center grew quiet in the gathering dusk, Miguel saddled his personal horse, a sturdy bay gelding he used for everyday work, and rode toward the hills beyond the property. Thunderstrike, released into his evening paddock, watched his human partner leave with alert interest. The small cemetery lay nestled in a grove of cottonwoods on the highest point of the surrounding landscape. Miguel dismounted, tying his horse to a low branch before approaching the two simple granite markers. Elena and Carlos Ramirez had been moved here 3 years earlier from the county's migrant worker section, given a dignified resting place overlooking the land where their son had found his calling. Miguel knelt between the graves, placing wildflowers he had gathered along the trail. "You wouldn't believe what happened, Mama, Papa," he said softly in Spanish. The wind through the cottonwoods seemed to answer, rustling like his mother's skirts on the rare days when she wasn't working in the fields. A soft nickering broke his reverie. Turning, Miguel saw Thunderstrike approaching across the hillside, having somehow opened his gate and followed Miguel's trail. The stallion moved with deliberate dignity, his black coat silver-touched in the fading light. "You old escape artist," Miguel said affectionately as Thunderstrike reached him, lowering his massive head to press gently against Miguel's shoulder. As the sun set over the Nebraska plains, Miguel stood between his parents' graves with Thunderstrike's reassuring presence beside him. Against the orange sky, their silhouettes formed a picture that had become symbolic to everyone in Willow Creek, a reminder that some connections transcend words, property, and even species, forged in the mutual recognition of hearts that found in each other the sanctuary the world had denied them both.